Welcome to my channel. This is my first video, and so I'm very new to this. I hope that this video will be interesting, and that you will learn a great deal from it. In this video, I talk about a missionary named Gützlaff and his involvement with an organization called the Chinese Union. Driven towards the evangelization of China in his lifetime, Karl Friedrich August Gützlaff, born 1803, died 1851, established the quote-unquote Chinese Society for Propagating the Gospel and the Chinese Christian Union. Later, this name was shortened to just Chinese Union. He established this organization in 1844 as one of Chinese preachers whose mission was to carry the gospel to every part of the fatherland. Unfortunately, poor health and scandalous reports of the Chinese Union led to his death in 1851, followed shortly with the complete dismantling of the Chinese Union. Gützlaff's reputation suffered immensely due to perceived mishandlings of the Chinese Union, although I'd like to point out that two scholars, one German Hermann Schleider and one American Jessie Lutz, have contributed significantly to developing a more nuanced, balanced understanding of Gützlaff, his life, and his involvement with the Chinese Union. Despite its collapse, the Chinese Union remains a very fascinating example of an indigenously operated organization which embraced Henry Venn, the missiologist, and his vision of developing the indigenous church through the three selves mission theory. In this video, using the papers of Karl Gutzlaff, which are made available through the Center for the Study of World Christianity at the University of Edinburgh, this essay or this video assesses whether the principles underlying the CU as derived through these documents can be viewed as a germ for the development of the indigenous Protestant church in China. Before we talk about Gützlaff, we must establish the scene. So following the 1717 ban on proselytization and construction of new churches, the Yongzheng edicts of 1724, 1725, and 1732 continued to authorize general persecutions against Christianity in China. Christianity at the time was seen as a subversive, heretical creed that destabilized the empire by meddling in court affairs, and the mere rumor of belonging was sufficient evidence for punishment. Anti-Christian policies would continue through Qianlong Emperor's rule, where foreign missionaries were banned from entering and Westerners were limited to the port city of Guangzhou for the purpose of only trading. Despite these prohibitions on missionary activities, the Catholic priests continued their pastoral duties, utilizing the established connections between missionary safe havens and local Christian communities. It was during this time that the beginning of the Protestant missionaries launched in China in 1807 with Robert Morrison of the London Missionary Society, who arrived at Guangzhou. Enthusiasm to reach hundreds of millions of unsaved souls with the gospel exploded among British nonconformist churches at the time. William Milne joined Morrison in 1813 to work on translations and publications. Walter Henry Medhurst also arrived in China in 1819. So these three M's, the Morrison, Milne, and Medhurst, all belong to the London Missionary Society. Contrast to them, in many ways, Gützlaff, the first non-British missionary to China, was quite different. He was born in Pyritz, Pomerania in 1803 and spent many years of his childhood living with a Moravian family and was deeply influenced by evangelical pietism, or what the early pietist leader Philip Jacobs Benner described as heart religion and concerned with the inner man. After his personal rebirth experience, Gützlaff was committed to this form of Christianity, which espoused a minimalist doctrinal system, and this would come greatly to influence his work with the Chinese Union. Prior to entering China, Gützlaff was assigned to work in Java in 1827 by the Dutch Missionary Society. In Java, he worked alongside Medhurst. Gützlaff was a very fast learner, and he learned the languages Fujianese, Cantonese, Hakka, and Classical Chinese. These would all be very important in his future work in China. When Gützlaff asked if he could work in China, the Dutch Missionary Society denied his request and claimed that China was too large of a country for even the ambitious Gützlaff. Following that, Gützlaff exited the Dutch Missionary Society, and despite his leaving that society, he closely identified with and enjoyed both financial and popular support with both the Dutch Missionary Society as well as the Dutch Reformed Church. In fact, these early Protestant missionaries to China rejected the Catholic missionary methods as what Gützlaff calls heretical. Their methods were seen as negative examples, despite their success of having about 300,000 Catholic Christians as early as the 1700s in China. So by disregarding Catholic missionary strategy, they were starting anew and enjoyed relatively fewer guidelines and considerable freedoms in their attempts to indigenize Christianity. However, the vast majority of these Protestant missions had very little success in making converts, and by 1840 there were fewer than 100 Protestant converts in China. Christianity had remained under a state repression, and missionaries had to operate covertly. A funny example I found was that Morrison went as far as to wear a false pigtail to keep a low profile. This unfavorable environment for open preaching and teaching makes it understandable that why most missionaries decided to work on translation and work with other texts rather than to do open preaching and teaching. So Gützlaff, in his exiting of the Dutch Mission Society, he became an agent of free missions, and so even compared to these Protestant missions, he had relatively more freedom in his choice of field and methodology. He was released from human authority and responsible only to God. While the other missionaries held to their denominational or societal ties, Gützlaff had this freedom as an independent missionary. However, this difference would become a source of animosity between these missionaries. The relationship between Chinese state and Christianity took a significant turn of changes, beginning in 1844 with a treaty between France and China, which allowed the French missionaries to build churches in new treaty ports. Then in 1846, Emperor Daoguang promulgated that the century-long repression of Christianity had finally come to an end. Edicts were passed to instruct magistrates to treat Christians as morally upright people and to suspend all prior investigations. However, missionaries were prohibited from entering inland China for evangelization. For Gützlaff, this loosening of relations translated into an opportunity to fulfill God's mission. In this next section, I will examine the three key principles underlying the Chinese Union according to the documents found in the archives. So it was in September of 1847 when the Evangelical Missionary Society of Basel sent this young Swedish man named Theodor Hamburg, along with his companion Rudolf Lechler, to Hong Kong in order to aid Gützlaff. 2 years later, in 1849, Gützlaff planned a tour of continental Europe, Britain, and Scandinavia to arouse the European Church to monetarily support, missionarily support the work in China. Prior to leaving, Gützlaff bequeathed to Hamburg a set of 22 remarks on how to properly manage the Chinese Union. So here I present three of the themes I found in this document. The first theme is a necessity of Chinese ownership despite recognition of cultural flaws. The second is an attitude of skeptical but trusting. And the third was Gützlaff's recognition of the role of God and the call to rely on God in the missionary activities. We begin with the first. So, a combination of Gützlaff's conviction in the Holy Spirit and that it could reside in any individual led to or convinced Gützlaff that the only way to succeed in the missionary and the evangelization of China was through Chinese preachers. If we look at the reported numbers of baptisms in the mid to late 1840s, we can see why he came to this belief. Whereas other foreign missionaries saw baptisms per year in the single or double digits, the Chinese Union reported a modest 262 baptisms in 1844. Then in 1846, the record-breaking number of 601 baptisms may be related to the pardoning of Christianity by Emperor Daoguang. Numbers remained healthy in the following years: 655 in 1847, 487 in 1848, and 698 in just the first two-thirds of the year 1849. A total of 2,703 baptisms. This is a huge number compared to other missionaries that saw single or double digits, as you recall. The more people who were baptized into the Chinese Union or into the church through the Chinese Union, we saw a small but significant portion of these newly baptized people become preachers of the Chinese Union. So a document in these archives also logged the names of over 100 Chinese preachers and the details of 124 mission trips, including names of preachers, their assistants, start dates, destinations, and durations. Gützlaff is often described as a hopeless romanticist and optimist by many scholars. However, this letter to Hamburg reveals that Gützlaff had a profound awareness of the many challenges that the Chinese Union faced, in particular to the qualities or characteristics of its Chinese members. He wrote about the laziness of the Chinese and how it must be resolved by giving them direct responsibility. They must be engaged, as if the work were their own, their responsibility towards their God and Lord. He also observed a wickedness of lying and falsehood ingrained in the Chinese character. He wrote that money had a great power in China, and preachers who joined the Chinese Union should not expect monetary compensation or future opportunities to work as teachers. So in this way, Gützlaff held a particularly strict view against quote-unquote rice Christians. He wrote that securing means are the last of all things, in the darkened mind the first and foremost. So in the mind of the godly person, securing means or ensuring financial stability is the last thing that he or she is concerned about. Whereas in the darkened mind, the sinful mind, this is the first thing and the most important thing. And Gützlaff wrote that should he fail to secure money for the Chinese Union, some preachers would have to be sent home, and they would have to find their own means of surviving. So it is clear that by 1849, the Gützlaff, he was not in the business of supporting indolent preachers through the Chinese Union. He understood the challenges of the Chinese character in regards to the missionary work in China through the Chinese Union. The second theme I titled Skeptical but Trusting. By 1849, Gützlaff's eccentric model of evangelization had captured the attention of many other missionaries working in China at the time. In particular, one very famous scholar and missionary named James Legge, who was very critical of Gützlaff. He came into contact with many members of the Chinese Union and found that most of them were ignorant of the very first principles of the Christian truth, and that not even one was able to repeat the Ten Commandments. In the spring of 1850, he wrote in the report that the Christian Union is a deeper sink of iniquity tenfold than our report will make it appear. He also held a particularly sinister view of Gützlaff, writing that my view is that he wears a mask of enthusiasm. I will not allow myself to write the qualities which lie to my mind beneath the mask. By 1850, these missionaries in Hong Kong had become increasingly successful in voicing their accusations against Gützlaff and the Chinese Union. Many of these Chinese missionaries or Chinese preachers were summoned to Hong Kong to be interrogated. A later report claimed that a substantial minority of the Chinese Union members were in fact opium smokers, and that the colporteurs hired by Gützlaff to sell religious books to other Chinese were instead being sold back to Gützlaff for a profit, and also that members stayed in Hong Kong and fabricated diaries of their mission trip inland. Because you see, Gützlaff required that the missionaries who went into China to evangelize were obligated to keep a diary of their mission trip. So these reports really made Gützlaff look to be the fool, since the Chinese had failed to convert, despite Gützlaff's emphasis for a true conversion. Among the criticism of Gützlaff's laxity, was particularly his perceived laxity in requirements for baptisms. At the time, China missionaries were constantly complaining about how the Chinese lacked a sense of sin. One scholar, Alexander Chow, has identified 3 major barriers in the East Asian understanding of sin. Most relevant here is that the Chinese ideologies are incongruent with Christian teachings on humanity and sin. Largely absent from Chinese thought was the dualism so pervasive in the biblical narrative: good versus evil, God versus Satan, absolute truth versus absolute falsity. More typical in Chinese thought was a principle of complementarity, for example, the concepts of yin-yang and the 5 elements. Because the Protestant missionaries saw the confession of sin as an indispensable step towards conversion, they really struggled with the nature and timing of baptisms for the Chinese. Some chose to baptize even when sin was not explicitly understood, trusting that they will be taught in their continued Christian education, that they would come to understand sin, whereas some were very stringent and would not baptize until they understood sin. This may have contributed to why numbers of baptisms were so low in those years. Because of this discrepancy in baptisms and requirements of understanding sin, some of these Chinese Christians were perceived by Western missionaries as actually not Christian and therefore not capable or not reliable for certain ministerial tasks. In fact, Jessie Lutz, the scholar Jessie Lutz, wrote about the tension between Hamburg and Gützlaff as early as 1847. In that year, Hamburg and Lechler wrote a critical report of Gützlaff and the Chinese Union and sent it back to their mission headquarters in Basel. So Lutz writes that shortly after their arrival, Hamburg and Lechler became disenchanted with the Chinese Union and declared their independence from Gützlaff that very year. However, the valedictory remarks written by Gützlaff to Hamburg was written in September of 1849, which suggests that either Gützlaff was not aware of Hamburg's disappointment in the CU, or perhaps more likely that Gützlaff chose the diplomatic route to ensure the continual operation of the Chinese Union. In either case, it is apparent that Hamburg was not able to sever ties with the Chinese Union, but rather in 1849 was appointed manager over the organization while Gützlaff went on his European tour to secure money. Many scholars have written that Gützlaff was a gullible person and cheated by his Chinese agents. How else could these Chinese missionaries stay in Hong Kong smoking their opium while writing diary reports and presenting these diary reports to Gützlaff? However, I find that Gützlaff was not such a gullible person, and that I agree with Stanley Lane Poole's assessment that Gützlaff was actually quite a suspicious person. Why do I say this? In the documents, Gützlaff warned Hamburg that there is a need for every new member of the Chinese Union to receive a testimony of their character and to have their doctrinal and scriptural knowledge tested in order to prevent insincere people from joining. All members, especially new members, would need to be carefully monitored for sincerity, knowledge of their Bible and theology, and the ability to preach. And according to Gützlaff, whenever controversies arose, members are not to be judged according to rumors, but rather through clear examination. This attitude he also held in response to his own critics. In one of the documents entitled Response to Criticism, particularly of James Legge of the Union, Gützlaff claimed that the accusations against the Chinese Union were unsubstantiated. Though he admitted that the Chinese Union is very weak and even humbly beseeched Dr. Legge to come in person and point out openly and publicly what is wrong amongst them, Gützlaff insisted that the Chinese meetings, which Legge did not attend, plainly demonstrated the sincerity of the Chinese members in both personal faith and missionary work. It is also said by scholars, some critics of Gützlaff, that he advocated a position that converts should be judged exclusively on by their behavior and not by knowledge of doctrines. This document presents a challenge to this understanding. In it, Gützlaff emphasized the need for strong biblical knowledge and pastoral practice. He writes, quote unquote, "The education of the preachers should be scriptural. Each and every one ought to learn by heart all the important chapters which bear upon doctrinal points. And in regard to the Lord's Supper, it should be administered strictly according to the Scripture." However, since these documents were written following the condemnation from missionaries in Hong Kong, some may dismiss them as not authentic. However, when we consider Gützlaff's sensitivity to true and false conversion signs, it is more reasonable to believe that he considered biblical knowledge to be a subset of certain infallible signs of true conversion. The third and final theme I found in this document, very briefly, is the prominent role of God and the call to rely on God. He remained true to his pietist background. In this document, it is deeply embedded with the complete surrender of himself as well as the Chinese Union to the fulfilling of God's purpose. Both the first and last remarks highlight the importance of God's presence in missionary work. In the first, he writes, "Nothing can be done without the Spirit of God. Implore his coming at every meeting." And at the last, he writes to Hamburg, "Be strong in faith and hope, for God is with you." This sort of language is permeated throughout his other remarks. The second implores the love of Christ, and that it must direct the thoughts and actions of every member of the Chinese Union. The 20th comment commends Hamburg to leave the whole work to God, to be instant in prayer and supplication, to work in faith and hope. Leave all to our Heavenly Father, whose powerful arms maintains and directs. So it is very important to understand the pietistic impulse of complete surrender to God's purpose in our appreciation of the Chinese Union. Next, we turn to the analysis section. We really come back to the question of whether the principles laid out in this document, namely the three I mentioned, can they be seen as a germ for indigenous Chinese Protestant Church? In his management of the Chinese Union, Gützlaff gave space both in theory and practice for the rise of indigenous Christian workers and leaders for spiritual and practical reasons. He believed that only when the Chinese took ownership of evangelism would they fully devote themselves to it, rather than exploit it as an opportunity for financial sustenance. The role of the missionary, Gützlaff believed, should be limited to that of, first, religious instruction, and second, economic support where only sincerely needed. He clearly recognized the challenges and limitations of burgeoning indigenous organizations and encouraged others to be patient and supportive. Above all, Gützlaff fully trusted that God was at work and that he, along with the Chinese Union, were tools of God's mission to evangelize China. So a couple parallels can be drawn between Gützlaff's management of the Chinese Union and later development in Protestant Christianity in China. The first is this the relationship to denominations. So I mentioned earlier that Gützlaff, he exited the Dutch Missionary Society, and by doing so he confirmed his disinterest in establishing denominational organizations. In fact, the Chinese Union was not connected to any denominations, though it received denominational support. So it was an independent organization. This parallels the contemptuous attitude towards denominations that was expressed by Chen Jingyi at the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910, where he says, "Your denominationalism, pointing to the West, does not interest Chinese Christians." Decades later, the Three Self-Patriotic movement leaders would repeatedly call for churches to sever their ties with Western imperialists and become self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating, an idea which they leveraged to eliminate foreign influences over China. So this anti-denominationalism or disinterest in denominationalism, we see this pattern in Gützlaff's Chinese Union, as well as later in Chinese Protestant development. The second parallel is the emphasis on indigenous leadership, or so indigenous membership, but primarily on indigenous leadership. At its core, the conflict in the early 1800s, mid-1800s between missionaries and the Chinese Union was fueled in part by disagreement over the roles that the foreign missionaries and the Chinese Christians would play in missionary and pastoral duties. So, as I already mentioned, Gützlaff was determined to encourage Chinese ownership. That was what he wanted to do, but Western missionaries, in particularly those with denominational ties, remained entangled over foundational issues such as baptisms, and this would lead to a very greatly limited autonomy to the Chinese Christians. So Gützlaff encouraged Chinese ownership. This issue was also brought up by Chen at Edinburgh Conference, where he emphasized the need for Western missionaries to give Chinese Christians much more responsibility in making their own decisions and managing their own affairs. Several independent Chinese churches movement of the early 20th century, such as the Jesus Family, the True Jesus Church, and the Little Flock, were characterized by their rejection of Western missionaries, and in doing so, they had to develop indigenized Chinese Christianity, indigenized leadership, and in doing so, they went through the process of indigenization of Chinese theology or Christian theology and spirituality. In a similar vein, the Three Self-Patriotic movement also rejected Western missions, though for significantly for political and nationalistic reasons. The third theme, which is quite different between Gützlaff's Chinese Union and later Protestant churches, is the topic of money. So when it came to finances, it is understandable that the Chinese Union could not operate without foreign finance, because Christianity at the time was extreme minority and those who converted were often ostracized and persecuted by even by their own family members. It just simply isn't possible for a Christian organization in China, to be fully funded by Chinese donors. However, by the 1940s, the situation had radically changed. Not only do we see a growth in capable Chinese Christian leaders, but also we see a change of attitude towards financial support from the West. In a Three Self-Patriotic Movement document, the Chinese leaders wrote that regarding financial support, there is nothing in principle that prevents its continuous. However, such financial support should be regarded as temporary in nature. In addition, several independent church movements, such as the Jesus Family, adopted a radical egalitarian communalism, and therefore they were free from Western financial support, and because of that, they were able to avoid, for a time, political backlash for associating with the West. So in conclusion, what do we say about the Chinese Union? I say that at least in theory and within the confines of its historical context, it demonstrated a partial success in redefining the relationship between Western missionaries and Chinese Christians. It really put a distance between the mission field and denominational bastions of the West. But the question was, can it be seen as a germ for development of indigenous Chinese Protestant churches in China? And the answer to that, I say, is that I believe that it mostly failed to develop such a formal church, primarily due to its inability to sever financial ties with the West, secondarily due to its continual reliance on theological instruction from foreign missionaries, and also because, as the scholar Professor Brian Stanley notes, that Pietism was not particularly interested in developing churches. It saw churches as a problem, not as a solution to the Christian movement. However, I note that one of the most important missing ingredients was the dignity of the Chinese people in their partially autonomous efforts to evangelize China. The Gützlaff's pietism here can be seen as a double-edged sword. Though he considered himself and the Chinese Union as fully committed tools for God's mission, the key word being tools, the sole focus or the emphasis on God's mission really left its tools desperately in need of the respect necessary for its continued success. So for these reasons, the Chinese Union failed to develop into an indigenous Chinese Christian organization. However, some of its themes that are noted, in particular its rejection of denominationalism, its emphasis for indigenous Chinese leadership, these all became very, very important in later development of the Protestant Church. In addition, some characteristics of pietism, namely the liberty in missional style and explosive power of the Holy Spirit, are principal to both the Chinese Union and later forms of indigenous Chinese Protestant communities. Indeed, these features, along with the greater freedom to develop their own theologies, have been greatly attractive to Chinese Christians who rejected or lacked access to more formalistic churches. Despite its collapse, the Chinese Union had not been a total failure. Several preachers who had originally sought baptism and membership for personal economic reasons went on to become quite important members of mission and translation history. Furthermore, a handful of Chinese preachers from the Chinese Union were hired by the London missionary societies, whereas others went on to the mission field as independent missionaries. For example, former Chinese Union evangelists are credited and remembered for the successful evangelization of some Hakka communities in Guangdong province in the 1850s. In Hong Kong, Gützlaff is commemorated via the Gützlaff Street. So on the one hand, his life and writings would inspire the missionary works of David Livingstone, missionary to Africa, as well as Hudson Taylor, missionary to China. By the way, Hudson Taylor was deeply influenced by Gützlaff's writing and later spoke of Gützlaff as the grandfather of the China Inland Mission. And his establishment of faith mission principles are largely drawn from Gützlaff's own experiences. On the other hand, Gützlaff baptized the sectarian leader of the violent Taiping Rebellion, Heng Xiuquan, whose personal theology was significantly influenced by Gützlaff's translation of the Bible. So undoubtedly, Gützlaff and the Chinese Union played significant influence on the development of both missionary Christianity in China as well as indigenous Christianity in China, both directly and indirectly. Some of the principles we see, or some of the foundational themes we see in the Chinese Union, are mirrored in the indigenous Christianities of China. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. It was a really fun project to write on Gützlaff. This video is based on my paper written for a class during my Master of Theology program here at the University of Edinburgh. I really enjoyed the process. It was great to learn about this man Gützlaff and how he really influenced, had significant influence, though he is not really remembered much in the church today. So part of my task here on this channel will be to connect or to bridge the work of the church and the work of the academia. As someone who feels called to the role of pastor scholar, this is particularly important for me. And in this paper, I learned the value of the study of history. In our study of history, we can see men such as Gützlaff, as well as all the countless men called to be preachers in the Chinese Union. They're great examples for us as Christians living today, called to faith in God, called to work for God, called to expand His kingdom. And we can certainly learn quite a bit from these historical events. Thank you again for listening. If you enjoyed this, welcome you to subscribe, hit a like, welcome you to comment. Any of these, just more interaction would be great. Welcome you to participate. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. God bless.